Hey everybody, this is a piece from Baruch Knei-Paz's book, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. This section is titled Political Morality, Means and Ends. All right. In February 1938, Trotsky wrote a long essay entitled Their Morals and Ours. Footnote. The essay actually first appeared in English in the New International in June 1938. End footnote. It was one of Trotsky's rare excursions into the field of ethical polemics. Trotsky's one other work, Terrorism and Communism, which dealt primarily with issues of a similar kind, but in the context of specific Bolshevik revolutionary policies, was discussed in Chapter 6 above. Their Morals and Ours argues the issues in a partly more abstract manner. End footnote. It was not, however, occasioned by any sudden or renewed interest in the subject, nor by any pangs of conscience arising in old age over the moral ramifications of what had been wrought in youth, though Their Morals and Ours did afford Trotsky the opportunity of reaffirming Trotsky's faith in the moral justness of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky would not have written Their Morals and Ours were it not for the fact that at the time, Trotsky had come under attack over Trotsky's position and actions 17 years earlier during the Kronstadt Rebellion. Footnote. The charges against Trotsky's Kronstadt, quote, record were raised by such former followers as Victor Serge, Dwight MacDonald, Max Eastman, and Boris Souverin. See, for example, the contributions by Serge and MacDonald under the title One More Kronstadt in New International in July 1938. See also Anton Siliga, The Kronstadt Revolt. I have some of that published on here. Emma Goldman, Trotsky Protests Too Much, 1938. For historical accounts of the Kronstadt Rebellion itself, see Paul Avrich, Kronstadt, 1921, and George Katkov, The Kronstadt Rising. End footnote. The moral stature of Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism in the 1930s was being questioned by throwing doubt on the integrity of Trotsky's own behavior while in power. The implication of this was that there was really no fundamental difference between Trotsky and Stalin and between Stalinism and Leninism. Footnote. This issue was discussed from a different point of view in Chapter 10. End footnote. Beyond the personal aspects of the accusations, however, the more general issues of means and ends, history and morality, individual responsibility, and social consequences were raised in order to expose the moral and historical bankruptcy, as the critics saw it, of the Russian Revolution and all those who had had a hand in it. This was, therefore, a direct challenge to the value of all that Trotsky held sacred. In a number of articles, Trotsky replied specifically to the Kronstadt charge. Footnote. Trotsky justified both the suppression of the rebellion and Trotsky's own role at the time, though Trotsky claimed that Trotsky himself was not directly involved, a claim largely at variance with the known facts. The concluding sentences of the last of the above-mentioned articles may serve to illustrate the manner of Trotsky's justification. Quote, idealists and pacifists always accuse the revolution of, quote, excesses, end quote. But the main point is that, quote, excesses flow from the very nature of revolution, which in itself is but, quote, excess of history. Whosoever desires may on this basis reject in little articles revolution in general. I do not reject it. In this sense, I carry full and complete responsibility for the suppression of the Kronstadt Rebellion. End quote. Trotsky. End footnote. In a number of articles, Trotsky replied specifically to the Kronstadt charge, but in Their Morals and Ours, Trotsky addressed himself to the general issues involved, responding in a characteristically assertive, confident manner, betraying doubts neither about the past nor about the differences between Stalinist and Leninist morality, and, in the process, defining the principles of Trotsky's Marxist ethics. Marxism in general, Trotsky began, and Bolshevism in particular, had been denounced as, quote, amoral, because Marxism and Bolshevism supposedly appropriated the Jesuit maxim that, quote, the end justifies the means, end quote. But what else, Trotsky asked, except personal or social ends could possibly justify means? What other moral criteria were there for determining the right or wrong of human behavior? Presumably such as stood outside society or were independent of man. Where did one find such criteria? Quote, if not on earth, then in the heavens, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. This is a footnote that I missed, actually. After an initial outburst against all those, quote, representatives of the, quote, left, end quote, who suddenly see no difference between, quote, reaction and revolution, Tsarism and Bolshevism, fascism and communism, Stalinism and Trotskyism, end quote. End footnote. The alternative, therefore, was either some conception of, quote, eternal moral truths, end quote, whose sources were explicitly religious, based on divine revelation, or some conception of human nature, which postulated the existence of some, quote, special moral sense, end quote, some kind of absolute substance, also eternal, unchanging, independent. But what was the latter except implicitly religious? A, quote, philosophic cowardly pseudonym for God, end quote. Quote, morality which is independent of ends, that is, of society, whether morality be deduced from eternal truths or from the, quote, nature of man, end quote, turns out in the end to be a form of, quote, natural theology, end quote. Heaven remains the only fortified position for military operations against dialectical materialism, end quote. Trotsky. Only with Hegel, Trotsky continued, did classical idealism succeed in secularizing morality, but, quote, having torn itself from heaven, moral philosophy had to find earthly roots, end quote. This task fell to Marxism, which discovered morality in society, in man himself, where in fact it had always resided. Hegel made an enormous step forward, but Hegel was only a, quote, stage between religion and materialism. Quote, to appeal now to, quote, eternal moral truths, end quote, means attempting to turn the wheels backward, from materialism to religion, end quote. Trotsky. Thus, quote, whoever does not want to revert to Moses, Christ, or Muhammad, whoever is not satisfied with eclectical hodgepodges, must recognize that morality is a product of social development, that there is nothing immutable about morality, that morality serves social interests, that these interests are contradictory, that morality more than any other form of ideology has a class character, end quote. Trotsky. Men, therefore, developed norms by virtue of their being members of society, and these norms were based on the character of social relations. Footnote. In an aside, Trotsky rejected the abstract generalization of these norms in the manner of Kant's, quote, categorical imperative, end quote. Since this, quote, embodies nothing concrete, it is a shell without content, end quote. End footnote. This being the case, only human, as opposed to supposedly supernatural, ends could be said to justify means. It was, however, absurd, Trotsky believed, to claim that an end could justify any means, no matter how criminal the means was, and so long as it advanced any chosen end. This was not, in any case, what the Jesuits had taught, and to attribute such a view to the Jesuits was to accept blindly the, quote, malicious, end quote, distortions of their Protestant opponents. Quote, Jesuit theologians, like theologians of other persuasions, occupied the Jesuits' selves with the question of personal responsibility. And what the Jesuit theologians actually taught is that the means in itself can be a matter of indifference, but that the moral justification or condemnation of the given means flows from the end. Thus, shooting in itself is a matter of indifference. Shooting a mad dog that threatens a child, a virtue. Shooting with the aim of violation or murder, a crime, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Trotsky's defense of the Jesuits did not, of course, extend to the content of their ends, which were for him, quote, reactionary in comparison with those of the Protestants. Though the Bolsheviks may have adopted the Jesuit maxim, Trotsky wrote, in terms of the Bolsheviks' historical role, the Bolsheviks were, in the 20th century, what the Protestants were in the 16th. This was not the first time that Trotsky had drawn such an analogy, and another example will be referred to later in this chapter. End footnote. Thus, not every end was legitimate by virtue of being an end. It had in itself to be justified, and thus no means was moral unless the end those means were meant to achieve. Excuse me, I'm fucking up here. Thus, not every end was legitimate by virtue of being an end. It had in itself to be justified, and thus no means was moral unless the end those means were meant to achieve was moral. Besides, Trotsky continued, means and ends frequently, quote, exchange places, end quote. An end could become a means, as when democracy was sought by the working class in order to be utilized as an instrument for realizing socialism. All the more reason, therefore, to concentrate on the moral legitimacy of ends, and to look upon means as a subsidiary problem to be resolved by difference to the moral stature and validity of the end. Footnote. Utilitarianism, Trotsky noted, in a two-quote retort. I don't know what that means. Tu quo quo, I don't know if I'm saying it, tu quo quo is a logical fallacy that discredits an argument by pointing out the opponent's hypocrisy. End footnote. In the last section of his essay, Trotsky pursued this argument to this argument's conclusion and attempted to justify in accordance with the argument the superiority of Marxist over other ends, and, thereby, of Marxist means. This last section, entitled, quote, the dialectical interdependence of ends and means, end quote, constitutes, therefore, the most important part of the essay and may be taken to define Trotsky's Marxist ethics. Trotsky asserted the following, quote, a means can be justified only by that means' end, but the end in turn needs to be justified. From the Marxist point of view, which expresses the historical interests of the proletariat, the end is justified if the end leads to increasing the power of man over nature and to the abolition of the power of man over man. The end is justified if the end leads to increasing the power of man over nature and to the abolition of the power of man over man. End quote, Trotsky. From this it followed that the aim here defined, that is, increasing man's power over nature and abolishing one man's power over another, was the ultimate end, which in itself required no justification, but was posited as a fundamental axiom. In this form, this ultimate end could be considered unobjectionable from points of view other than the Marxist alone. Footnote: as was pointed out by John Dewey in John Dewey's reply to Trotsky's essay, see John Dewey, Means and Ends, The New International, August 1938. End footnote. In this form, this ultimate end could be considered unobjectionable from points of view other than the Marxist alone, though Trotsky did not concede this and appeared to believe that it was peculiarly Marxist in character. In any case, if this was the ultimate end, then socialism and the proletarian revolution were means to it and were to be justified only if they advanced this end. And indeed, this is precisely what Trotsky asserted, quote, that is permissible, ... which really leads to the liberation of mankind. Since this end, the liberation of mankind, can be achieved only through revolution, the liberating morality of the proletariat of necessity is endowed with a revolutionary character, end quote. Trotsky. Why, however, could this end be achieved by revolution only? Because in Trotsky's view, revolution as a, quote, rule of conduct, end quote, was, quote, deduced, end quote, from the, quote, laws of the development of society, thus primarily from the class struggle, this law of all laws, end quote. This does not mean that in the, quote, class struggle, end quote, all means, however base, were permissible. Quote, permissible and obligatory are those and only those means, ... which unite the revolutionary proletariat, fill the revolutionary proletariat's heart with irreconcilable hostility to oppression, teach the revolutionary proletariat contempt for official morality and official morality's democratic echoers, imbue the revolutionary proletariat with consciousness of the revolutionary proletariat's own historic mission, raise the revolutionary proletariat's courage and spirit of self-sacrifice in the struggle. From this it flows that not all means are permissible, end quote. Trotsky. Quote, socialist ends, end quote, Trotsky once told a follower, quote, could never justify any means. One cannot be both Robespierre and Napoleon. One has to choose, end quote. This was said by way of explaining his decision in the 1920s to oppose the then emerging Stalinism. See Fred Zeller's article, First Impressions of the Old Man, in Le Monde, English Weekly Selection, 10th of September 1969. End footnote. If this sounds too general, lacking in precision as to what specifically may or may not be done, Trotsky himself conceded the vagueness of his criteria. There was no ready answer, Trotsky wrote, as to, quote, what is permissible and what is not permissible in each separate case, ... Problems of revolutionary morality are fused of the problems of revolutionary strategy and tactics, end quote. Only in the course of actual revolutionary practice could specific answers be arrived at which were at the same time the framework of the overall Marxist philosophy of morals. This philosophy, Trotsky continued, did not, quote, recognize any dualism between means and ends, end quote. Quote, the end flows naturally from the historical movement. Organically, the means are subordinated to the end. The immediate end becomes the means for a further end. In his play, Franz von Sickingen, Ferdinand Lassalle puts the following words into the mouth of one of the heroes. Quote, show us not the aim without the way. For ends and means on earth are so entangled that changing one, you can change the other too. Each different path brings other ends in view, end quote. ... The dialectical interdependence between means and ends is expressed entirely correctly in the above quoted sentences. Seeds of wheat must be sown in order to yield an ear of wheat, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. The lines from LaSalle, incidentally, are quoted as an epigraph in Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. The English translation of these lines the English translation of these lines here is as in Koestler. Wikipedia says Franz von Sickingen lived from 1481 to 1523 and was a knight of the Holy Roman Empire who, with Ulrich von Hutten, led the so-called, quote, Knights' War, and was one of the most notable figures of the early period of the Protestant Reformation. Sickingen is posthumously known as the, quote, Last Knight, an epithet Franz von Sickingen shared with his contemporaries Chevalier de Bayard and Emperor Maximilian. I actually want to see something real quick. I want to see how you actually pronounce Ferdinand Lassalle, because I always assume that it's Ferdinand Lassalle, but I'm feeling insecure that it might be Lassalle or Lassalle.
Ferdinand Lassalle. Ferdinand Lassalle.
Oh, it is Lassalle. All right, I've been saying it right. Here we go. Back to the text. The final paragraphs of Trotsky's essay were devoted to the question of terrorism. Footnote. Trotsky's views on terrorism, both individual and that decreed by a revolutionary government, were discussed in Chapter 6 above. End footnote. Here, Trotsky restated the well-known Marxist instrumental attitude to terror. Terror was legitimate if aimed at, quote, individual oppressors, end quote. Terror was carried out not as an act of, quote, individual terror, end quote, but within the framework of a mass movement and as a means which was, quote, expedient, end quote, from the point of view of revolutionary class struggle. Footnote. When in 1934, Trotsky's name was linked in the Soviet Union with the assassination of Kirov, that's Sergei Kirov, Trotsky issued a press statement in which Trotsky declared that throughout the whole of Trotsky's life, Trotsky had opposed, quote, individual terrorism, end quote, whether against Tsarism or against Stalinism, since this was not in the interest of the workers' movement. See Trotsky's statement to the press, reprinted in Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1934-35. End footnote. The relevant question, therefore, was, as always, did terror advance the ultimate end of the liberation of mankind? Individual, isolated terror could not be seen to do this. Terror, as one possible means available to the working class movement, could have this effect, though it was a tactical means and not a substitute for the general strategy of revolution. Terror, Trotsky concluded, was in any case not subject to judgment in accordance with some, quote, moral absolute, end quote, forbidding the, quote, murder of man by man, end quote. Its morality was to be determined by its capacity for serving the goal of human liberation. Footnote. The argument of their morals and ours appears also in a concentrated form in the previously mentioned article by Trotsky defending Kronstadt. End footnote. The logical fallacy of Trotsky's analysis of the relationship between Marxist ends and means was pointed out by John Dewey in a reply published 2 months later to Trotsky's essay. Footnote: Trotsky, who must have read Dewey's article, especially as it was originally published in the New International, never replied to Dewey's article. The two, of course, knew each other as a result of the 1937 Commission of Inquiry into Soviet charges against Trotsky, which Dewey chaired. End footnote. Writing as one who also rejected every form of absolutist ethics based on a, quote, moral sense or, quote, eternal truths, and as one who therefore held that, quote, the end in the sense of consequences provides the only basis for moral ideas and action and, the only justification that can be found for means employed, end quote. Dewey accepted Trotsky's argument about the interdependence of means and ends, and even, as it was formulated, the liberation of mankind as the ultimate end. But Trotsky, Dewey argued, had been inconsistent. If means and ends were interdependent, if those means were justified which led to the ultimate end, it became necessary to examine each means separately, with a view to ascertaining as far as humanly possible what the consequences of the means would be. Quote, one would expect, then, that the ideas of the liberation of mankind as the end in view, there would be an examination of all means that are likely to attain this end, without any fixed preconception as to what they must be. The means must be. Sorry, let me repeat that. Quote, one would expect, then, that the ideas of the liberation of mankind as the end in view, there would be an examination of all means that are likely to attain this end without any fixed preconception as to what these means must be, and that every suggested means would be weighed and judged on the express ground of the consequences it is likely to produce. End quote. Dewey. This was not, however, the course which Trotsky had chosen. Dewey continued. Instead of examining independently the efficacy of all means in terms of the end, Trotsky had decided that those means were appropriate which were derived from the, quote, class struggle, end quote. Thus, quote, means are, quote, deduced, end quote, from an independent source, an alleged law of history which is the law of all laws of social development, Instead of interdependence of means and ends, the end is dependent upon the means, but the means are not derived from the end, end quote. Dewey. Dewey thus rejected Trotsky's deductive approach as being inconsistent with Trotsky's own argument about the, quote, interdependence, end quote. Dewey thus rejected Trotsky's deductive approach as being inconsistent with Trotsky's own argument about, quote, interdependence. Only the inductive approach could determine which means were or were not legitimate. Trotsky's way led to a prejudgment of means. The class struggle, Dewey added, was not necessarily ruled out as a means for attaining the end, but it had itself to be justified, and there was no reason to suppose that it was the only means. In any case, the existence of a, quote, fixed law of social development, end quote, was irrelevant. It could not be the source for rules of conduct if the principle of the interdependence of means and ends were to be sustained. Even if the validity of such a law were to be established as conclusively as that of a law of physics, it could not be the basis for a, quote, moral end, end quote. Since physical laws had no moral implications, and it could not be assumed that such a law necessarily led to the, quote, liberation of mankind, end quote, for such an assumption was merely, quote, arbitrary and subjective, end quote. Dewey. In this connection, Dewey may have added that it was, after all, pure chance that the law of social development, which Marxism claimed to discover, accorded, so Marxism also claimed, with the advance of mankind towards increasing self-liberation. Suppose Marx had discovered that history showed the opposite, that the laws of social development led to greater enslavement. Would it be moral to act in accordance with such laws? It would certainly be futile not to accept the reality of such laws, but acceptance of reality did not determine one's moral judgment of reality. It would be merely ridiculous to claim that whosoever reconciles himself to, for example, the law of gravity sees in the law of gravity a moral end or good. Moral ends, obviously, were determined by individual choice, not by laws of nature, or even by laws of human history. Footnote. Dewey concluded, quote, Orthodox Marxism shares with Orthodox religionism and with traditional idealism the belief that human ends are interwoven into the very texture and structure of existence, a conception inherited presumably from its Hegelian origin, end quote. John Dewey, end footnote. But it was, of course, precisely because Trotsky was a Marxist, that is, committed to certain assumptions about the workings of human society, that Trotsky could not take a purely pragmatic approach to ends or abandon preconceptions about such sacred axioms and the means they generated as the class struggle. This also governed Trotsky's definition of what constituted the, quote, liberation of mankind, end quote. Quote, their morals and ours, end quote, posited an ultimate end which, as has been pointed out, may not have been objected to by non-Marxists as well, if only for the reason that it was so general in character. The essay did not, however, show why socialism necessarily constituted the greater liberation of mankind, though this also, like other, quote, means ends, end quote, could not be ruled out in advance. It needed to be justified. Here, too, Trotsky's only justification was that it followed from historical laws of development. It did not occur to Trotsky that the concept of, quote, liberation, end quote, was a function of certain values, and that whatever history did or did not teach, it was these values, granted even that they were rooted in social conditions, which determined the kind of content which each individual would choose to ascribe to the condition of liberation or to that of liberty. Trotsky did not raise, in the other words, the problem of the concept itself, nor of the potential conflicts between its various attributes, nor of the distinction between the condition of liberty and the conditions for liberty. Footnote. The issues touched upon here have been discussed in much of the contemporary literature on political theory, but the most clearly defined treatment of the subject is Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty. End footnote. In our discussion of their morals and ours, we have left out referring to the middle part of the essay in which Trotsky dealt with the difference between Stalinist morality and that of Leninism and Trotsky's own. This part may now be considered, and it is best done in conjunction with another of Trotsky's essays, written in the middle of 1939, which also treated of this specific subject. Footnote. This article is a polemic aimed mainly at Victor Serge and Boris Souvarine. Both had by then broken with Trotsky. The 1939 French translation of Their Morals and Ours was issued in pamphlet form and was preceded by a prospectus which simplified and distorted Trotsky's views. Trotsky assumed it was written by Serge, but the latter later denied this. Conceding the factual error of his assumption, Trotsky nevertheless remained unimpressed by Serge's protestations. End footnote. The gist of Trotsky's arguments here may be briefly stated, since they were merely an extension of what Trotsky had said about Marxist morality in general and about Stalinism and Leninism elsewhere. The general basis for the distinguishing between the latter two was, in Trotsky's view, the very simple one that Stalinism could in no sense be considered a doctrine which aimed at the establishment of socialism. This being the case, Stalin could not appeal to Marxist morality, since that morality recognized as legitimate and justified only such means and policies as advanced socialism. Stalin's objectives are not the, quote, liberation of mankind, end quote, but mankind's enslavement in a new totalitarian form. The problem, therefore, was not that Stalin used terror, violence, lies, and calumny, but these instruments were utilized for non-socialist purposes, and on this basis were rendered immoral. Footnote. Trotsky wrote admiringly of Lenin's brother Alexander's complete devotion to the truth and his inability to tell a lie. However, he pointed out the lie can sometimes be a revolutionary weapon. Alexander's failure to recognize this made him more a, quote, knight than a politician, end quote. On Trotsky's view of the, quote, revolutionary function, end quote, of falsehood, see also Culture and Socialism. End footnote. Nevertheless, Trotsky argued, the use itself of such instruments under Stalin took a form it never had and was never intended to have under Lenin. It was not only that Lenin had represented the aspirations and interests of the proletariat while Stalin reneged on them through bureaucratic rule, it was also that under Lenin, terror, violence, lies, and so on had been employed during the most difficult period of revolution, the Civil War, a period which decided the very fate of the revolution. At such time, particularly excessive measures were essential and unavoidable. Witness, Trotsky wrote, Lincoln's actions during the American Civil War, not to mention those of the Paris Communards. If the French Revolution, more specifically the French Revolution's Jacobin phase, was the begetter of democracy, then, quote, democracy came into the world not at all through the democratic road, end quote. Trotsky. And it could not have been otherwise, for the great transformations in history were, quote, bloody end quote, breaks within history. But the Civil War period in the Soviet Union had ended long ago, and the proletariat had emerged from the Civil War period triumphant. The means then used were no longer essential and were certainly avoidable. Already under Lenin they had been suspended. Stalin, however, renewed them, and not for extraordinary purposes of civil war, but as a normal method of government. These methods were made necessary by and were employed to perpetuate the policies of his Thermidorian reaction, which aroused the opposition of the masses. The difference, therefore, between Lenin and Stalin is not simply reducible to the kind of Hottentot morality, the quote Hottentot morality, according to which the same means, when used by the one, were, quote, good, and the other were, quote, bad, and by the other were, quote, bad, all depended on which side you were on. It went deeper, to the fundamental distinction between the ends of the one and the ends of the other. Quote, only that which prepared the complete and final overthrow of imperialist bestiality is moral, and nothing else. The welfare of the revolution, that is the supreme law, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See also Trotsky's observations on the moral character of Lenin in Trotsky's The Young Lenin, and on the degeneration of political morality in the 20th century in Stalin. End footnote. Wikipedia says Hottentot is a term that was historically used by Europeans to refer to the Khoek, Khoek, Hoe, the indigenous nomadic pastoralist in South Africa. Use of the term Hottentot is now considered offensive, the preferred name for the non-Bantu speaking indigenous people of the Western Cape area being Khoekhoe. Back to the text. There was, of course, some truth in Trotsky's claim that Trotsky and Lenin could not be simply identified with Stalin without doing violence both to historical analogy and to common sense. Yet one cannot help but be amazed how persistently Trotsky continued to miss the point of the comparison of Leninism with Stalinism. Whatever the differences in degree, his critics insisted there was no real difference in kind between the two. The historical problem was not so much whether Lenin had resorted to the same scope of authoritarian methods as Stalin, nor even whether Lenin's ends had been nobler. The problem was whether Leninism had not created a precedent for Stalinism. Once again, therefore, the argument over Bolshevik morality was really the argument over the extent to which the ends the Bolsheviks sought were shared by the social classes, the workers and the peasants, whom they presumed to represent. In both the articles by Trotsky which we have here discussed, Trotsky spoke of the Bolsheviks as having gauged the true, quote, trends among the masses, a theme which was, of course, repeated in all his writings on the revolution. But what were these trends in fact? Or rather, how far did these trends have anything to do with the concrete socialist ends which the Bolsheviks presumably were intent on pursuing? The element of consensus about ends was crucial here, for upon that consensus would depend the means chosen to bring about the ends. In reality, such consensus had proved to be largely chimerical, as had the ripeness of Russian society for socialist institutions, and thus the Bolsheviks had chosen to impose themselves upon society. Therefore, means were derived from the socialist ends. Therefore, means were not derived from socialist ends, but from considerations of political and economic survival. The Bolsheviks were in any case inclined and prepared. What else was Leninism about? To use autonomous political means to preserve themselves in power. But the contradiction between backwardness and socialist ends, a contradiction Trotsky had understood as well as anyone, reinforced this tendency and eventually made a virtue of necessity. The moral dilemma, therefore, was not primarily that of the use of coercion, terrorism, or violence in general, as means in the restricted tactical sense, but rather of a form of political rule which could not maintain itself without turning such violence into a comprehensive and habitual system. Not everyone was bothered by the reality of this moral dilemma. Trotsky was, but Trotsky cannot be said to have come to resolve this moral dilemma. The end. Thanks for listening.